Welcome back to another episode. This time it's the Porsche Boxster. We're going to start with the very first, the 986, which came out in 1996. And then we're going to go all the way to the present day. And I will just add, at the time of making this video, you can still buy a brand new 718 from Porsche in most countries. However, about the middle of this year, that will likely be the end of the brand. So when I'm releasing this, it's April, I think this video will come out. That gives you maybe 2 months if you have always wanted to get yourself a brand new one of these. The new model that comes out after this, which will follow on from the 718, that is likely to be either an entirely electric car or electrified, but it's looking more and more like it will be an EV version. I know some people are looking forward to that, some people not so much. And so if you want a combustion car, especially if you want one of those GTS 4-litre cars, or even an RS version or a Spyder or something like that, you need to get your order in now. So I just thought I'd put that in at the start. But I know most of you watching this are going to be thinking about buying one used across the generations. So let's kick off with the 986. But there's a couple of things I have to say about the 986 before we get moving into the rest of the video. And that's that this is a car that saves the brand. Okay, the Cayenne will come in about 2002, and that will change the brand's fortunes for the better, pretty much ongoing after that time. But in the early 90s, things are not looking good for the brand, and they're struggling to reinvest enough into future models to really bring in and pull in those customers that had once bought the car and now were not starting to show up to dealers as much as they had been. It really is a critical time for them, and you really cannot put it into words, because there may not have been the brand we know today if it wasn't for the Boxster model. Now that may seem like I'm overdoing it, but you have to remember, so many sports car companies have come and gone over the decades of the past. There are brands that you would have thought would never have failed, which no longer make cars. And so it really is a case that when the 986 comes out, it's shown to the world and becomes a commercial success, that the brand can finally take a sigh of relief, move forward, and give us the fantastic vehicles that we've experienced ever since. So 1996 is the launch. However, we're going to go back to 1991. In 1991, that was when the brand decided they were going to do a Boxster model. They then produced a prototype in 1993. The prototype was based on the 550 Spyder prototype or concept. There had been 3 concepts that the brand had put together, and the 550 Spyder was the one that they had picked. They showed it in the 1993, I think it's the American Auto Show, and then they released in 1996 the first ever Boxster model. Now, if you're looking in these early vehicles, the 96 to 99, they are 2.5 litre engines. All of the Boxsters in this generation have M96 engines. They start off with a 0.20, then they move to a 0.22 and a 0.23, and the S model gets a 0.24. Now, if that doesn't mean anything to you, do not worry. We're going to go through the power and the models in just a second. What I want to say about this model, though, is that if you're going early, you have to be aware that there was an issue with porous engine blocks. They did become known. I think there's several attempts to try and rectify them, but because of that, really, I'm going to say I would look for a 2.7, which is 99 onwards, rather than a 96 to a 99. If you're used to sort of working on cars yourself, you're not looking for something pristine, you just want to have some fun, an early 2.5 isn't, it's not the worst car in the world. It's just, if I was looking to own something and possibly keep it for a while, I probably would not be looking at early 2.5. They're 201 brake horsepower in those early 2.5s, just so you know. I just wanted to get that out there on the 2.5. I say it's not that I necessarily think it's a terrible engine to go for, but it is probably the one that I'd only be going for if I was looking for, say, something to run around on a track for a budget. If I was just looking for a car for a summer. If you're looking to sort of get one, maintain it yourself, spend as little money as possible and have the enjoyment of owning the car, also. But if you're like most people and you want something that you can enjoy, take it for a service, not worry about too much, and hopefully not face some of the bills that do come along with these cars. I remember I did a short stint working in car parts for a while, and I had a guy call me up once who had a 986, I think it was a 99 or a 2000 model, and I can't remember what he was after. It was either brakes or suspension or something like that. He called me up and he said, I'm looking for basically the best but cheapest parts I can find. The car is, I think it was not that highly valued, maybe up to £5,000, sort of up to $7,000. Just, can you find me some parts? And I found him some, but they were about 20% of the value of the vehicle. And he said, oh, you know, I'm not a rich man, I just like enjoying this car. And I said, no, I understand, but unfortunately there is a price premium that goes with the badge, and that just comes about because parts manufacturers have to decide where they want to shift their manufacturing, their economies of scale. And if you're going to make something in the pattern part area of this world, it has to be for a high enough volume, and it has to fail enough for you to make them en masse. The advantage with the Boxster, it's not an unreliable car. The other advantage is that, you know, there were quite a lot of them made, but not quite enough for tons of parts companies to get involved. And Porsche prices, I'm sure you can appreciate, are higher than most manufacturers, unless we're looking at the other sort of big, faster cars out there. So, something to bear in mind. Now, on the 2.7, you'll have 217 brake horsepower early on, up until 2002, when there is a facelift across the range, and then you'll have 222 brake horsepower from there on. Now, I know many of you are waiting to hear about the Boxster S, and I'll come on to that in just a second, because I think, to be honest, that is the one that most of you will be looking to buy. However, I wouldn't completely overlook a well-kept 2.7 model. If you've got a fair budget and you're looking around, if you can find a facelift 2.7, it's over 220 brake horsepower. If you keep them well, they can still drive fantastically. Yes, they'll never quite be a 3.2 S model, and they don't have all the specification that the S gets. However, I remember when I sold used cars, and I did do quite a while in some prestige and sports car areas, we would get these Boxsters in, and sometimes you'd find a 2.7 that really had, you know, just the town added to it on the options list. And so sometimes you can get a car that was actually more expensive than a base S. And on the used market, honestly, they don't command that much of a premium. So I'd suggest having a good look around. And if you find a good 2.7, go and have a look at it, go and have a drive of it. Because as many people will tell you, I'll just overlook them, go straight for the S. You know, if everyone does that, then regular Boxster prices just keep depressing. And that makes them a bit more tempting, while the S keeps getting pushed up a bit. And some S's, having seen them, yeah, they're more powerful, but if they haven't been well kept and they've just got a bill as big as the value of the car to go with it, I don't know. I think I'd rather have a well-kept 2.7, especially a facelift one, than sort of a ragged-around S model. The S, it starts with 247 brake horsepower, gets a small bump up to 254 brake horsepower in 2002. Honestly, you know, the ones that have been really, really well kept on these are generally some of the facelift S's, because everyone knew they would probably have a little bit more value. They're also more expensive. And if you want one of the ones that are on a funky colour, they usually are the facelift S models. So that's just something to bear in mind. An old colleague of mine, his dad had I think it's Speed Yellow. S model, loved it, garaged, all that type of things, really well kept. Something like that can be a great bargain. And 250 horsepower, in the world of the crazy horsepower we have today, doesn't sound a lot. But once you get it on a back road, roof down, second gear, foot to the floor, in this sort of weight vehicle, you'd probably surprise yourself how much the car will have more ability than you. Okay, so yeah, that wraps up the 986 generation. The one thing I want to add, if you're watching this in Finland, Valmat Automotive actually made some of the 986 and the 987 model at their plant there. So there are some of these early ones, the 986 and the 987 generation, that are Finnish birth, if you like. So if you're in Finland and you're looking for a weekend car, you could try and track down one of the ones that were made in Finland, and then you'd have a domestic car, which is quite a thing if you're in Finland. So yeah, just thought I'd add that in there. And if you want the sort of the most special, if you like, or the particularly sort of standout model of the first generation, then you'll be looking for a 550 Spyder. It is painted the same colour as the Carrera GT model. I've written down the paint colour, just GT Silver, sorry. I made a quick note of that and thought it would be more spectacular. But yes, GT Silver, 550 model. They're not that easy to find. If you do find them, the owners will want a premium. They're based on the S model. Nice, and a nice bit of history to know that you've got the one named after the concept. So just something to add there. Let's move on to the second generation, the 987. This model heralds the return of the oval headlights after the fried egg headlights of the 996, 911 generation and the 986 Porsche Boxster. Interestingly, this is also where the Cayman comes in. The Cayman will be covered in a separate video because it has a lot of its own sort of special editions, so they'll cover that another time. But interestingly, this is the one that, whereas the first generation is it's really building up the supporters of this, and there's a lot of criticism at first from many different sides of the Porsche community. So they're saying, oh no, a Boxster, that's not a proper one. They're basically saying the 911 is the only one to buy. But in the 987 generation, especially with the Cayman's introduction, we see a softening of attitudes. And to be honest, I think that was an incorrect attitude to have from the beginning. If you've ever driven a Boxster, you'd probably change your view on it. You know, they are a special sports car in their own right. They aren't trying to compete with the 911 model, nor should they. They're not trying to compete on price either. But in this generation, because the styling returns back to the more traditional look of the Porsche models, I think that we can all agree that if you were a bit on the fence about the first one, the second one does it for you. The second one does have to go through a little bit of revisions though, because it starts off with the previous engines and then works its way into a new set of engines. So if we just cover the Boxster first, the first engine, by 05 to 07, it has 237 horsepower, 07 to 09, 242 brake horsepower from the 2.7 engine. In 2009, it then has the 2.7 replaced with a 2.9 engine that has 252 brake horsepower. The 2.9 also brings in, a lot of the facelift features, and having driven both of them, there is more than just the sort of 10-15 horsepower difference. There does feel like a lot more time was spent to really make. It's an odd one because you have this sort of whole new model come out between 986 and 987, so first and second generation. And revisions within generations aren't supposed to give you the same sort of step change. However, having driven the 2.7 and then driven the 2.9 on the base Boxster model, I would say there is a step change. It does feel like a different engine. It delivers power slightly wider throughout the band. And because there's a few other revisions going on with suspension and things like that, if I was in the market, I would try and go for a 2.9. If I didn't have the budget for it though, it's fine. You can go for any of the earlier ones. Probably I'd try and go for an 07 to 09 to get that slight horsepower bump and a few other revisions that came along with it. But if you can't, you can't. What I would say is if you go for an early one, you have at least got sort of the previous engines tried and tested by this point. But yeah, there's a few aspects to really sort of talk about on the 2.7, and I think it does very well as a sports car. The 2.9 is just taking that and it's pushing it into where the car, for many people, should have been from the beginning. But of course, it took time to get there. And I think we can all appreciate that. If you've got the budget, I'd probably go and look for, say, a slightly higher mileage 2.9 than a lower mileage 2.7, as long as it had the history. If you can only find a really clean 2.7, I'd still go for a 2.7. And I wouldn't be too worried about whether it was the 05 to 06 or the 07 08. I know some people will be critical of that online, but honestly, having driven them, having seen the servicing reports on them, and having had a look, obviously there is a buyer's guide to this generation as well, so you can have a look through that. But for me, yeah, that's my feeling on it anyway. So that's the Boxster model. Now, in the S model, we start off with the same 3.2 from the previous generation, and then we're going to jump up to the 3.4. So if you're looking for an 05, 06, 07, you're going to get the 3.2 276 brake horsepower from, that's the previous engine. Okay, the previous S engine, 276 brake horsepower on this. And funny enough, where I said on the previous one I would probably try and edge my way into the 2.9, I wouldn't be so worried about edging myself into the 3.4, even though there is quite a horsepower jump over the 3.2 on this generation. And that's only because at this point of power and having driven them, I quite liked the earlier ones. Again, not probably such a popular opinion. I know a lot of people will say, look, if you can stretch to the 3.4, why wouldn't you go for it? And I agree. But if you can't quite stretch for it, especially if you're looking at a Boxster model and you're saying, I could probably just about get myself into the 2.9, but then you find yourself a nice early S model with the 3.2 engine, I wouldn't be scared of it. I'd actually be quite tempted by it. As long as it's got all its service records there, and there's enough for you to say, do you know what? I think I'll be able to enjoy that, and I won't be upset that I didn't go slightly newer, but with the Boxster model. So yeah, just a side note there. Now in 2007, it gets a 3.4 engine With the 3.4, you get power of 291 brake horsepower until 2009, and then there is an increase to 304 brake horsepower, which takes the Boxster to the end of its life before it's replaced. For those of you that like your special editions, the Spyder model comes in on this generation. Now, they're first introduced in 2009. They're released in 2010 as a 2011 model year, so you'll get about an 18-month run, 316 brake horsepower. Many of them are specified with PDK, however, they were offered with a manual. Of all of the cars in this generation, if you're looking for a Spyder, you are looking for one with potentially, well, you're definitely looking at one with the highest pricing, okay? But if you find a manual, the trouble you're going to have is you are going to be coming up against collectors, okay? The first ones of these in manual, they have found their way into collectors, and collectors are willing to pay a little bit more for them because every year the manual Spyder, first ever one, 2011, sold in 2010, that's becoming just a little bit more desirable, especially now as we hear more and more about the Boxster model disappearing or becoming a full EV. That Spyder manual, 316 brake horsepower, last of this generation before we move to the next generation. You know, you're going to have to give up quite a lot of budget if you want to go into that. So it's just something to be aware of. The PDK still tempting for collectors. However, because of the gearbox, some people just won't want it in their collection, so you probably find a slightly better deal. Manuals are by far and away, the Spyder manual is by far and away the most expensive on this generation that you can buy. So just something to be aware of. Is it worth it? You have to go and experience one. Honestly, having never driven the Spyder, no one ever came in with the Spyder. I can't say 100%. What I would say is, looking at the premium that you're going to be paying, I think you're probably, for 9 times out of 10, 9/10 on the road, 8/10 on the road, you'll probably be able to have as much fun in a facelifted S model. But, who am I to say? I could be wrong. I think the problem a lot of Spyder owners face is, because their car is going up in value and because they're quite expensive to buy, are they really willing to push their car as much as if they just bought themselves a good S model in the first place? That's for you to decide. And so that marks the last of this generation, and with it, we bring in the 981 model. Now, on the 981, we're going to have the last naturally aspirated engines, because in the 718 generation, or I should say the last naturally aspirated of the regular range, so the regular Boxster and the S model. In the 718 that comes after it, they both are switched to turbocharging. Because of that, prices are staying pretty strong along this model, and to be honest, I can see why. These are a really good drive. The gearing is the one minor criticism I might have about them. 718 probably doesn't really help too much with this either. There's a lot of criticism about longer gearing to shorter gearing, but there's a lot of conversation you'll find about this online. Honestly, if you are someone that just wants to drive and you're not too fussed about how a gearbox feels, I wouldn't worry about it. And I know a lot of you, despite what every enthusiast say, will probably end up picking a PDK because that's the one that's been chosen the most for most markets. And so, yes, it's nice to have a manual, but if you've got a partner and they say they want the automatic, better to have the car with a PDK than not have it at all. So, what do we got? Well, we start with a 2.7 and then we go over to a 3.4 for the regular models. 2.7 model has 261 brake horsepower, and then I made a quick note for the 3.4, 311 brake horsepower on the 3.4. Then the GTS with the 3.4 pushes this to 325 brake horsepower. Now, what's important to note is that while the S model gets the previous engine from the last generation, the regular Boxster ditches the 2.9 that it previously had and brings in a new 2.7 engine. So it's kind of an interesting mix that we have, because the S sort of carries over, then gets a new engine, then the Boxster gets, carries over and then gets an updated engine, and then the Boxster gets a new engine and the Boxster S doesn't, and you kind of keep going along like this. Honestly, I wouldn't let it change really the decision I'm going for, because both engine codes are the same on the 3.4 and the 2.7 in this generation. Okay, so you've sort of had one being updated, then the other, then the other. I think really it kind of speaks to how Porsche are working in the Boxster into into their lineup at the time. They're having to invest and then bring up the other one and invest in that one and then see do they want to mix some technology with a 911 or not when it comes to the S model and the GTS model. Now, as I mentioned, this is the generation where you have naturally aspirated engines, and it's the last of it. And because of that, there are slightly stronger prices than you may expect, especially when there is a 718 and that has sold well enough that it could have depressed the prices on this previous generation. However, I will put a word of note, and I think what you've got to be careful of is online, a lot of people will talk to you about what's going to hold its money the best. No one can predict that. And people will also talk about what's the most desirable and what's going to be the most desirable in the future. No one can predict it. But what I would say when it comes to what people will want in the future, there's no way of telling how that will affect price, because maybe everyone wants a car in the future, but they don't want to pay the price premium on it. So that kind of happens with fast Fords is a good example, where they move up and up and up in price. And either they are the sort of concourse model, and then they'll keep rising up in price and go into some collector's edition, collection for a ton of money, or they'll hit their ceiling, where people say, actually, for a bit more than that, I can go into XYZ car. Okay. Similar story going on here, where people will say, well, if you can get yourself, an S model with a naturally aspirated engine, or if you can get that GTS model with a naturally aspirated, if you can get it in a manual, people won't want the turbochargers in the next generation. They'll pay more in the future. You've got to think about how people's attitudes will change. And in 10 years' time, to be honest, we'll be looking at a world much more electrified. The idea of having a fast car with just an engine, whether that engine is turbocharged or not turbocharged, will still factor in, but you may find that people don't put as much value on it as they do today. Just a word of warning, I could be wrong, of course, but I'm kind of just seeing a slight softening, especially when it comes to the generation coming through that will be buying cars in 10 years time that are 20 years old. They grew up with turbocharging, and they don't seem to see it as a particularly negative thing, especially when it comes to performance of sports cars. If they can have the same performance and possibly have higher tunability from a turbocharged engine, that may be a slightly different attitude than we have today. So just bear that in mind. Just go into this and buy the one that you think you're going to enjoy. Be careful of people telling you, well, if you buy this one, you probably won't lose any money and you can keep it for 5 years and just service it and you'll get your money back. Be really careful of that. We've gone through a lot of movement in the car market, and I think especially in Boxster models, we just have to remember there is a 911 range out there. And as Carrera and Carrera S models become cheaper and then sort of have their bounce and become classics, you'll be pulling a market in every which direction. So just be aware of that. Now, the ultimate version of this generation is, again, the Spyder. It's sharing an engine with the GT4 Cayman, 370 brake horsepower from a 3.8 litre engine. And again, unfortunately, I think for many of you, this will just be pressing you price-wise if you're looking at a Boxster model, because you'll be deciding between a 911 or one of these Spyders. And hey, it's a good place to be if you are choosing between them, but just be aware, it's not going to be like choosing between a base Boxster and a Boxster S and, well, are you willing to pay a small premium? There is quite a big jump. What I would say, if you're thinking, look, I want naturally aspirated thrills and I'm willing to pay a little bit more, but not tons more for it, the S and the GTS are probably the ones to look at, okay? Again, don't buy them for future value, but the Boxster is absolutely fine. And if you're just looking for a weekend car and you're not someone that really needs to take their car to 8 or 9 or 10 tenths on the road, you just want something nice that you can drop the roof on and is a nice, desirable thing to own, get a regular Boxster. Everyone else, the S and the GTS is where you want to be. Be aware, you'll be paying a premium for it, and no one can guarantee you'll get the extra money for it, but you'll certainly get the extra smiles from it. I remember driving the GTS on this generation. It's quick, it's fun. I really don't have lots of bad things to say about it. And especially when you look at the 718 and you look at these two on the road and you think, because the 718 switches to a 2.5 turbo in the GTS model before it becomes the 4 litre in 2020, which we'll get onto in a moment, there is this sort of gap where having a GTS a sweet thing, but again, you will pay for it, so just bear that in mind. That takes us to the end of this generation and to the final generation, which is the 982 for Porsche coding, however is actually the 718 for its sort of brand name. But we can still call it the Boxster model because Porsche. And so we're into the last generation of the Boxster as we know it. The 718 model, it has there's 3 engines actually in total. Let's just go through all 3. So you start off with a 2-litre turbo, 296 brake horsepower. That's in the Boxster model, okay? Then we have a 2.5-litre turbo engine. I made a quick note, 345 brake horsepower. Okay, so 345 horsepower in the 2.5 turbo S, 296 in the 2-litre turbo Boxster. There is then the GTS, which for 2016 to 2020, let's probably say more like for sales terms, sort of late 2016 to early 2019. There is the GTS with the 2.5 turbo, 360 horsepower. The interesting thing for the GTS on this one, that particular model is kind of depressed in the market. So if you're looking for something a bit faster, a bit sportier on the outside, a bit better setup than the S model, I would have a look around the GTS, just because the GTS becomes the GTS 4-litre in 2020, and the 2.5 4-cylinder turbo GTS is a little bit unloved because of that. Now, it's not completely unloved, but it does mean that if you're willing to step up the budget just that little bit from the S, you might be able to find yourself a nice GTS. So that's just a little tip there. Honestly, having driven these and having heard people say, oh no, you know, they don't like it because it's 4-cylinder and it's turbo and everything else, you know, I think you've got to decide what's more important to you when you're driving, okay? If it's all about the theatre, the noise, the impression of being something and doing something, rather than just actually sort of carving up the corners and enjoying the physical act of driving, then you probably do want one of the engines, the 4-litre really. You know, you want to get yourself into the naturally aspirated engine. If you're more about just being able to go out on a weekend morning on your own or with your partner or with your friend or whoever and just enjoying a drive, and you know, honestly, I'd put something like a Miltech exhaust on the back of one of the 4-cylinders. It's still a Boxster engine, so it doesn't sound, you know, like a Golf GTI or something like that. It does have a unique sound to it. A little bit Subaru-ish, but, you know, you can't help that. They're both Boxster engines. But it still has something unique to it. I wouldn't be sort of completely depressed about having one. And I think sometimes these things get a bit overblown in the press. You have to remember, when we're testing cars, when we're driving them, when we're having to write driving impressions, when we're having to carve out articles day after day, numerous articles each and every day to hit deadlines, you are sometimes trying to find the finer aspects of the car that you do or you don't like to write about, okay? And so I'd be a bit careful on when journalists say, well, it's okay, but it's not great. What they really mean is, on this scale, for a journalist, it's huge. For the average person out there who just wants a nice drive, there's a margin that's worth talking about, but it's not the chasm that you're probably reading. So that's just something worth noting. The GTS model particularly, the main criticism it actually had against it was that it didn't move the game on from the earlier GTS on the previous generation. But you know what? It came in with a turbocharged 4 from a naturally aspirated 6, and the fact it wasn't going backwards, you know, it was able to keep things where they were, was actually quite an achievement. Now I know the one that people will still really want is the 4-litre. So, and then on the 2020 GTS, it's the 4-litre, 396 brake horsepower, so nearly 100 horsepower per tonne. And with it, huge audience. You know, the people... And the interesting thing I would say here, go on to Porsche's configurator and have a look at a base Boxster model. Now, I did this in the UK and the USA just to check there wasn't going to be some chasm in pricing, and there wasn't. They're both very, very similar in those two countries. And I said, well, let me pick a Boxster, but let me just add the additions that I would want with it. Because the base Boxster, you know, you want to put some wheels on it, sports exhaust, you put some extended leather and some detailing on the outside, and before you know it, you start to get very close to the base price of the GTS model. And the GTS already has quite a few features on it, so you can be a bit lighter with the options. It's very interesting when you do it. I'd say there was still a price gap of, say, 15% between them, but when you then spec up a Boxster S and you start to put things on that, you get very close to GTS price. And you think, well, if I've got these options, to be honest, while I can, let me have the 4-litre. There was also the Spyder model. The Spyder has 414 brake horsepower And then there was the Spyder RS. This is 2022, this comes out. It's essentially a celebration of the car, a realization that with new laws coming in, new regulations, tougher and tougher emissions laws that are really going to aim at knocking out any of the budget cars. Budget is the wrong word. The entry sports world of larger engines is the best way of putting this. They're going to be knocked out of most markets. The only ones that will be able to survive are the ones that can demand a high enough price premium to have huge amounts of investment in R&D. That's what happens to the GT3 911 model, and it continues with a 4-litre. In the Boxster, realistically, it just couldn't happen. And so the RS comes out 494 brake horsepower, or 493 brake horsepower, I think. And, you know, these are pretty much going straight from the factory to people's collections. Some people are driving them, and it's fantastic when you see one. You go to a car show and someone's driven it there, and they're going off, you know, that weekend somewhere. It's fantastic to see. But I think for many of you, the Spyder models probably not be what you're looking for. I can't blame you for that. If it was me and I was looking at one of the 718 models, I'd try and do my best to stretch into a 4-litre. It adds some theatre. It adds just a lot of aspects about a sports car that people want if they're not driving it every day. What I think the S model and the base Boxster do is, if you're going to buy one and you want to use it all the time, every single day, you want good fuel economy when you can get it, and, you know, power and some sporty driving whenever you can take advantage of a good road, they'll be perfect for you. You know, they'll do the job, and then you won't suffer some of the penalties that come along with the 4-litre model. However, for the rest of you, I mean, the 4-litre is even not that bad on fuel. It's quite incredible, really. So that would be my side on that. I'd go for a GTS with a 4-litre if I could. If I was looking for a bargain, I'd go for the 2.5 turbo GTS model because they're a bit depressed in the market. Otherwise, if you just want something you can enjoy, find something that's been well kept. Would I be too fussed between the 2-litre and the 2.5? You know, I'm an enthusiast, so I'd probably plump to go for a 2.5, but honestly, a 2-litre will probably do many people enough for the job. It is 300 horsepower after all. And so, as I mentioned at the start of the video, it looks like it will be about either June or July. The last 718s will be built, and that will be the end of this vehicle. There is talk of an electric vehicle. There was a concept EV vehicle, I think about 2021 or 2022. They let a couple of magazines go out and drive what was essentially like a skeleton of a vehicle, EV, and a lot of them reported very positively that it at least drove very similarly to the sort of cars they had known from the brand previously in this sort of mid-engine specification. However, you're not going to get the theatre of an engine, but it will make lots of sort of whooshing noises and everything else that the Taycan has. And for some people, that's exactly what they want. I wouldn't be surprised if they just go with an EV model. However, many, especially in Volkswagen and a lot of the German manufacturers and the Japanese manufacturers, have looked at this EV market now and they've said, yes, about a third of the market will probably go EV, but there will still be a combustion engine market, and possibly if we can match it with hybrid, that will be the way we look. With the 911 GTS having this sort of hybridized gearbox motor to sort of make it hybridized, possibly that could be something they look at in this model. I wouldn't hold my breath. If I wanted to make sure I got one, I'd just get down to a dealer before June, July of this year. But yeah, that's where we stand with it. So I hope that's helped. And if you've enjoyed the video, consider subscribing. There'll be many more videos like this coming along soon. Take care for now.